Right now, in the pre-dawn hours of the Persian Gulf, a VLCC, a very large crude carrier called the Hadera Star, is sitting anchored 17 nautical miles off the coast of Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates. It has been sitting there for 11 days. It carries 2 million barrels of crude oil. That cargo, fully loaded, is worth approximately $160 million at current market prices. And it is going nowhere. Not because of a storm, not because of a port backlog. It is sitting there because its war risk insurance premium tripled overnight and its operator, a mid-sized Greek shipping firm, cannot currently get underwriters in London to extend coverage for transit through the lower Gulf. You will not see that ship on the front page of any newspaper. But what is happening to that ship and to the 43 other tankers that have quietly altered course, reduced speed, or sought new anchorage across the Gulf of Oman in the past 3 weeks is the opening act of an oil disruption that the mainstream financial press has almost entirely missed. Here is what the mainstream media is not telling you. The global oil market is not experiencing a shortage. It is experiencing something structurally more dangerous, a simultaneous compression of the insurance corridor, the routing corridor, and the financing corridor for crude oil moving from the Persian Gulf to the economies that need it most. The price of oil on the futures board in New York tells you one number. What is happening on the water tells you something entirely different. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly 3 things. First, how a specific sequence of military and political decisions over the past 18 months created a choke point crisis that standard commodity reporting cannot capture. Second, why the countries most exposed to this disruption are not the ones you expect, and what happens to their economies in the next 90 days if this does not resolve. And third, what the 3 possible trajectories forward look like, and why the one that keeps strategic analysts awake at night is currently more likely than official statements will admit. Stay with me. To understand what is actually unfolding in the Gulf right now, you have to go back to October 2023. That is the moment when the architecture of oil transit security that had governed the Persian Gulf for 3 decades began to fracture. Not in a single dramatic event, but in a series of incremental decisions, each reasonable in isolation, each catastrophic in aggregate. The Houthi missile and drone campaign that began targeting commercial shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden in late 2023 is by now well documented. What is less understood is what that campaign did to the insurance market for the entire Gulf region, not just the Red Sea corridor. When Lloyd's of London and the Joint War Committee formally added the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and portions of the Arabian Sea to their listed areas of enhanced risk in December 2023, they triggered a cascade of policy repricing that extended far beyond the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Underwriters began quietly reassessing the risk profile of the entire Persian Gulf corridor. By February 2024, war risk premiums for tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz had already risen 30% from their 2022 baseline, even though the strait itself had seen no direct interdiction. Then came the decisions. In April 2024, the United States imposed additional sanctions on Iranian oil exports that targeted specifically the shadow fleet, the aging, uninsured, or opaquely insured tankers operating outside the Western insurance architecture that had allowed Iran to continue exporting roughly 5 million barrels per day, primarily to Chinese teapot refineries. Those sanctions had an unintended effect. They pushed more transactions into informal arrangements and drove legitimate tankers operating in the broader Gulf further into the arms of Western underwriters who were already nervous and repricing accordingly. In September 2024, Iraq's federal government and the Kurdistan regional government failed, for the 4th consecutive time, to reach agreement on revenue-sharing terms tied to the Kirkuk-Ceyhan pipeline, the critical artery that moves Kurdish crude through Turkey to the Mediterranean. That pipeline, which had been dormant since a March 2023 arbitration ruling forced its closure, remained shut. That is approximately 400,000 barrels per day that has been missing from global supply for over 2 years. A fact that received enormous coverage when it happened, and almost none since. Then, in January 2025, the Israeli military conducted a series of strikes on Iranian-affiliated weapons storage and command infrastructure in southern Syria that Iran characterized, through back-channel communications, as a red-line escalation. Iran did not respond militarily in the direct sense. Instead, it responded institutionally. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGCN, began a program of what Western naval analysts quietly describe as assertive presence operations in the lower Strait of Hormuz. Not interdiction. Not seizures. Presence. IRGCN fast attack craft operating in larger numbers, at closer ranges, with a higher tempo of interaction with commercial shipping. That word, presence, is important. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. The navigable shipping channel within that strait is less than 2 miles wide in each direction, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. When the IRGCN deploys patrol boats in that channel at high tempo and without predictable schedules, it does not need to fire a single weapon to raise insurance premiums for every tanker captain and every shipping operations desk in the world. By March 2025, the combination of Houthi activity in the south, IRGCN presence operations in the north, and the ongoing structural gap created by the Kurdish pipeline closure had created a condition that Lloyd's actuaries began internally modeling as a correlated risk event, meaning the multiple risk factors were no longer moving independently of each other. They were feeding each other. And that changes the mathematics of insurance pricing in a way that is nonlinear and, in practice, very hard to reverse quickly. Let us now examine the military dimension of what the IRGCN has actually deployed, because the specifics matter enormously and they have received almost no coverage in the Western financial press. The IRGCN's maritime capacity has undergone a significant modernization over the past decade. The fast attack craft now operating in the Strait of Hormuz are not the improvised gunboats of the 1980s tanker war. They are primarily Zulfiqar-class and Sina-class fast inshore attack craft, vessels capable of speeds exceeding 40 knots, armed with anti-ship missiles, including the domestically produced Nasser-1, which has a range of approximately 35 kilometers. These are not weapons designed to sink a VLCC in a conventional sense. They are weapons designed to credibly threaten it, and in the insurance calculus, credible threat produces the same market effect as actual attack. But the more significant development is what is operating above the water, not on it. The IRGCN has dramatically expanded its use of maritime surveillance drones, the Shahed series variants configured for sea surveillance, which now provide persistent overwatch of the shipping lanes through the lower Gulf. What this means in practice is that IRGCN Command can track in near real time the position, heading, and AIS identification of every commercial vessel transiting the strait. That surveillance capability did not exist at this level of fidelity 5 years ago. Here is something that no naval analyst had documented in modern history before 2024. For the first time, a regional naval force below the threshold of a great power possesses both the persistent surveillance architecture and the standoff strike capability to threaten every single vessel in a major global choke point simultaneously, without crossing into open hostilities and without triggering the formal mutual defense thresholds of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, which is based in Bahrain. That distinction between action and presence, between interdiction and implied threat, is precisely where the IRGCN is operating. And it is a space that the international legal architecture governing freedom of navigation does not handle well. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, defines innocent passage for commercial vessels through territorial waters, but it does not prescribe clear remedies when a coastal state's naval forces create ambient risk through proximity and tempo rather than explicit interdiction. The U.S. Fifth Fleet has conducted freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs, through the strait on a regular basis. But a FONOP demonstrates American capacity. It does not reduce the IRGCN's presence, and it does not reduce the insurance premium that a Norwegian shipowner pays to move a cargo of Saudi crude to South Korea. What changed in the past 90 days, and this is the development that is genuinely new, is that 3 major international marine insurance syndicates quietly moved the Strait of Hormuz and the entire Persian Gulf onto a pricing tier that previously only applied to the Bab el-Mandeb. That reclassification was not announced. It appeared in policy renewal documents and in the terms issued to shipping operators when they sought coverage extensions. The result is a war risk premium environment in the Gulf that, for VLCC operators, now adds approximately $300,000 to $400,000 per voyage above what was standard in early 2023. That number sounds abstract? We are going to make it very concrete. The precedent that matters here is the 1980s tanker war, when Iranian and Iraqi forces attacked over 400 commercial vessels in the Persian Gulf over an 8-year period. That war produced a specific insurance market response. Lloyd's created the Gulf of Oman Institute time clauses, which became the standard framework for Gulf war risk coverage for decades. That framework was built for a world in which attacks were episodic and kinetic. It does not price the kind of persistent subkinetic ambient threat environment that the IRGCN has now constructed. The tanker war framework that existed before 2024 is not coming back. The insurance market will not return to 2022 baseline pricing as long as this operational posture persists. That threshold has now been crossed. This is the section where we connect the military situation to your daily life. And I want to be precise about the mechanism, because it is not obvious from watching oil prices on a financial terminal. The immediate market reaction to the IRGCN presence escalation was, in fact, muted. Brent crude moved from approximately $78 per barrel in early February to $83 in March, a $5 increase that financial media attributed largely to OPEC production discipline and seasonal demand factors. That attribution is not wrong, but it is incomplete. It misses the structural cost layer that is building beneath the headline price. Here's the transmission mechanism. When war risk premiums rise for Gulf tanker voyages, the additional cost does not fall on the oil producer. It falls on the voyage operator and ultimately on the buyer, the refinery at the end of the chain. For a VLCC carrying 2 million barrels on a 30-day voyage from Ras Tanura to Ulsan, An additional $350,000 in insurance cost translates to roughly 17 cents per barrel delivered. That number sounds small, but it compounds across the entire cargo, across the entire year, and, critically, it interacts with other cost pressures that have accumulated simultaneously. Because of the Red Sea rerouting that began in late 2023, cargo moving from the Gulf to Europe that would previously have transited the Suez Canal is now going around the Cape of Good Hope, adding approximately 10 to 14 days of sailing time and an additional fuel cost of roughly $250,000 per voyage for a standard medium-range tanker. The two cost increases, Suez rerouting and Gulf insurance repricing, are not related militarily, but they have stacked in the financial accounts of every oil importer over the same 12-month period. The downstream industries most affected are not the ones that lead the commodity news cycle. The obvious answer is aviation fuel, diesel, and heating oil. Less obvious, the petrochemical feedstock industry, which sources naphtha from Gulf crude for plastic packaging, agricultural film, and pharmaceutical blister packaging. Naphtha crack spreads, the margin between crude oil and naphtha derivatives, have widened by approximately 14% since January, and that has transmitted directly into packaging costs for food manufacturers in Germany, Japan, and South Korea. The countries most exposed to a prolonged Gulf insurance crisis are precisely the ones whose economies can least absorb the shock on short notice. Japan imports approximately 88% of its crude from the Middle East, the majority of which transits the Strait of Hormuz. Japan holds approximately 254 days of crude oil reserves between government strategic stocks and industry stocks, the most robust reserve buffer in the world. Japan can absorb a medium-duration disruption. South Korea holds approximately 97 days of reserves and sources approximately 70% of its crude from the Gulf. It is more exposed. India sources approximately 65% of its crude from the Gulf and holds between 20 and 25 days of strategic reserves in its current operating posture, a number that has been a persistent concern among Indian energy security planners for over a decade. A sustained, insurance-driven shipping contraction does not produce the same headline drama as a physical blockade, but for India's energy infrastructure, the practical effect on import capacity begins to resemble one within 60 to 90 days. Let me put this in concrete terms. This is not abstract economics. This is a direct line from an IRGCN fast attack boat operating near the Larak Island approaches to the price of diesel at a fuel station in Chennai, the cost of plastic packaging on a bag of lentils in Osaka, and the price of heating oil in a suburban home in South Korea. The Gulf insurance crisis is not a futures market story. It is a supply chain infrastructure story. And it is moving through the global economy right now, largely beneath the coverage threshold of mainstream financial media. If you want to understand how this hits your economy before the mainstream media catches up, make sure you are subscribed. The analysis we do here tracks the structural layer, the insurance markets, the routing decisions, the reserve day counts, not just the headline price of crude on a Tuesday afternoon. One additional data point that crystallizes the exposure: the global fleet of available VLCCs capable of operating in the Gulf under current insurance terms has effectively contracted by approximately 9% in the past 60 days, as operators have either suspended Gulf voyages, transitioned to spot charters at premium rates, or reclassified vessels under flags of convenience to access non-Western insurance frameworks. A 9% contraction in available lift capacity does not disappear into the market without consequence. It shows up as a premium paid by the buyer at the end of the chain. Now let us move to the diplomatic layer, because the military situation and the economic pressure do not resolve themselves. They require someone to make a phone call, and understanding who is calling whom and why tells you everything about how quickly this can or cannot be resolved. The United States posture in the Gulf right now is formally described as freedom of navigation enforcement combined with defensive deterrence. The Fifth Fleet continues its operational tempo. The Combined Maritime Forces Coalition, which coordinates naval escorts in the broader Gulf region, has not significantly changed its operating parameters since late 2024. What has changed is the appetite in Washington for any action that could be characterized as escalatory with Iran, during a period when the broader diplomatic architecture, including indirect discussions over Iranian nuclear commitments, remains technically alive, if barely. Iran's public position is that it is not engaged in any unlawful activity in the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGCN's operations are characterized in Tehran as routine sovereignty exercises and legitimate security operations within Iranian territorial waters and exclusive economic zones. That framing is diplomatically constructed to avoid providing a formal legal basis for a U.S. naval response under UNCLOS. Iran's domestic audience hears something different: the narrative of successful deterrence against American and Israeli military pressure, delivered through tools that impose real economic cost on adversaries without crossing a kinetic threshold that would justify direct retaliation. The Gulf Cooperation Council states Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar are in an uncomfortable position. They benefit from high oil prices. They do not benefit from a Gulf insurance crisis that makes their own crude exports more expensive to move, and that introduces a systematic risk premium into every long-term supply contract they hold. Saudi Aramco has quietly raised the issue in consultations with European buyers about the long-term contract implications of sustained premium pricing. The UAE has taken a different approach. Abu Dhabi has accelerated discussions with Chinese state insurers, specifically PICC, the People's Insurance Company of China, about alternative insurance frameworks for Gulf-routed tankers outside the Lloyd's architecture. That conversation, which began in early 2025, is significant because it suggests the UAE is hedging against the possibility that this insurance disruption is not temporary. China's role here is the one that receives the least analytical attention. China is simultaneously Iran's largest crude customer, the Gulf state's largest trading partner, and a potential alternative insurance provider for tankers that cannot access Western coverage. Beijing has a structural incentive to see Gulf shipping continue without Western architecture insurance complications, but it also has a structural incentive not to be seen as the entity that allows Iran to escape the pressure of American sanctions by providing a parallel financial system for its oil exports. These incentives are in tension, and China is currently threading that needle by maintaining the PICC conversations at a commercial rather than a political level. The unexpected mediating presence in this situation is Oman. Muscat has historically maintained diplomatic backchannels with Tehran that date to the pre-nuclear deal era of the early 2010s. The Omani government, under Sultan Haitham bin Tariq, has in recent months hosted a quiet series of consultations between Iranian foreign ministry officials and intermediaries with access to European energy buyers, specifically around the question of what operational modification by the IRGCN would be sufficient to trigger a material reduction in war risk premiums. That question, which is essentially asking what Iran needs to be paid diplomatically to reduce a below-threshold military posture, is not one that any party can discuss publicly, but it is the question on which the trajectory of this crisis actually depends. There are 3 scenarios from here. Each is possible. Their relative probability tells you how to position your understanding of what comes next. The first scenario is negotiated resolution. This requires the United States and Iran to reach a tacit understanding, not a formal agreement, not a public announcement, about the parameters of IRGCN activity in the lower Gulf. The mechanism would likely involve a reduction in U.S. enforcement tempo against the Shadow Fleet in exchange for IRGCN return to pre-2024 operational baseline in the Strait approaches. Oman would facilitate. Neither side would acknowledge the arrangement publicly, because both sides have domestic audiences that would reject it as capitulation. The economic incentive for this resolution is real. Iran's own budget projections for fiscal 2025-26 are based on oil export revenue that is harder to realize when the global tanker market is tightening. The difficulty is that neither side can move first without domestic political cost. A negotiated resolution is possible. It requires roughly 4 to 6 months of sustained back-channel engagement and at least one off-ramp event, a diplomatic gesture, a sanctions carve-out, a joint statement on nuclear talks that allows both sides to characterize the de-escalation as something other than concession. Possible. Difficult. Not guaranteed. The second scenario is continued attrition. The IRGCN presence operations continue. The insurance market remains repriced. The shipping costs accumulate. In this scenario, the week-by-week economic cost is not dramatic, but it is real and compounding. Every week of sustained Gulf insurance premium elevation adds approximately $400 million in aggregate freight and insurance costs across global oil trade. Over a 6-month period, that is roughly $10 billion in frictional costs that do not appear on any oil price chart, but that get absorbed by refiners, passed to manufacturers, and ultimately priced into the goods on the shelf in front of you. In this scenario, India faces the most acute medium-term pressure because its reserve buffer is thinnest and its domestic political environment makes visible fuel price increases particularly costly for the government. A sustained attrition scenario increases the probability that India seeks bilateral arrangements with Gulf producers that bypass the standard tanker market entirely, locking in dedicated vessels under long-term charter with alternative insurance coverage, effectively bifurcating the Gulf tanker market into Western insured and non-Western insured streams. That bifurcation, once it hardens, is structurally very difficult to reverse. The third scenario is the one that strategic analysts discuss privately and governments will not name publicly. It begins with a miscalculation, not a decision, but an accident, an ambiguous incident in the Strait where an IRGCN fast attack boat and a U.S. Navy vessel or a commercial tanker under escort collide, or exchange fire under circumstances that neither side can publicly characterize as unambiguous. This is the scenario that keeps strategic analysts awake at night. Not because anyone wants a Gulf conflict, No party, including Iran, has an interest in kinetic escalation that would trigger direct U.S. military response against IRGCN infrastructure and Iranian naval assets. But because the operating tempo in a constrained 21-mile waterway between two naval forces, operating under different rules of engagement and without a formal communications deconfliction protocol, creates conditions where miscalculation is not a theoretical possibility. It is a probability function of time. If the current IRGCN posture continues for 12 to 18 months, the probability of an incident that neither side intended but that neither side can walk back without domestic political consequences becomes, in the assessment of several former naval intelligence officials who have spoken publicly about this, uncomfortably high. In that scenario, Brent crude does not move from 78 to 83. It moves from 83 to 140 in a 72-hour window. The global insurance market for Gulf tankers does not reprice upward. It closes, and every calculation that Japan, South Korea, India, and China have made about their energy supply for the next fiscal year becomes invalid simultaneously. Watch the Lloyd's Joint War Committee quarterly review, due in June. Watch the India Petroleum Ministry's emergency reserve tender scheduled for late spring. Watch the IRGCN's operational posture around Larak Island over the next 30 days. Those three signals will tell you, before any official statement does, which of these three trajectories the Gulf is moving toward. Let me connect this directly to your life. The gas in your car is priced by the cost of moving crude from the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz to a refinery, a journey that now costs more than it did 2 years ago and more than any futures price chart reflects, because the additional cost is embedded in the insurance layer, not the commodity layer. The plastic packaging on your groceries is priced by the naphtha crack spread, which is responding to Gulf crude availability. The cost of air travel, which has remained elevated since 2022 for reasons the airlines publicly attribute to labor and maintenance, carries within it a jet fuel surcharge component that is sensitive to Gulf tanker availability. The price of fertilizer, which is synthesized from natural gas that moves through Gulf-adjacent infrastructure, feeds directly into the cost of the food you buy. The shipping premium on manufactured goods moving from East Asian factories that source Gulf-adjacent energy inputs adds a layer to every consumer product that crosses an ocean. Zoom out from all of that for a moment. What is happening in the Persian Gulf right now is not a war. It is not a crisis in the tabloid sense. It is something more structurally significant. It is the gradual, deliberate stress testing of the physical infrastructure of the global economy by a regional power that has concluded, correctly, as it turns out, that it can impose significant economic costs on its adversaries and their allies without crossing the legal or military threshold that would trigger the conventional deterrence mechanisms that Western powers have spent decades constructing. The global order that assumed freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf as a given, enforced by American naval supremacy and underpinned by Western insurance architecture, is being tested in a way that existing tools handle poorly. The question that this video cannot answer, and the question that will determine everything about the economic outlook for the next 12 to 18 months, is this. Is the current insurance market repricing a temporary response to an elevated but temporary threat environment? Or is it the first stage of a permanent structural repricing of Gulf transit risk that reflects a genuine, durable shift in the military balance of the strait? If it is the former, oil markets normalize, shipping costs recede, and the story becomes a footnote. If it is the latter, if the insurance market is correctly pricing a new equilibrium of ambient risk in the world's most important oil choke point, then every model, every reserve calculation, every supply chain assumption that the global economy currently operates on needs to be revised. And that revision does not happen in a press release. It happens slowly, quietly, in the renewal documents of insurance underwriters in London, in the route planning decisions of tanker operators in Athens, and in the reserve tender documents of energy ministries in New Delhi. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening, not the headlines, not the noise, but the full picture, share it with someone who needs to see it.